When you think about ancient empires, they rise and fall, right? But very few manage to control a territory as huge and as diverse as the Mauryan Empire. We're talking about a system established way back around 322 BCE that wasn't just impressive for its time. It was a totally revolutionary achievement in how to run a country. So let's dive in and see how on earth they pulled it off.
I mean, just take a look at the scale of this thing. We're talking an area stretching from the mountains of modern-day Afghanistan all the way across to Bengal and deep down into the south. And that's not just a challenge of sheer distance, right? It's about how you bring together countless different cultures, languages, and local economies under one single system.
And that really brings us to the big question, doesn't it? Without phones, without the internet, without any of the tools we completely take for granted, how did the Mauryans create a stable, functioning state on a subcontinental scale? Well, the answer lies in their truly remarkable administrative machine.
All right, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll get a real sense of the problem of scale they were up against. Then, we'll look at the political philosophy that was basically their blueprint. We'll take apart the administrative machine itself, see how the famous Emperor Ashoka changed its entire purpose, and finally, think about its lasting legacy.
Okay, so first things first, let's really wrap our heads around the core problem here. Running an empire this massive meant you had to have a system that could collect taxes, keep the peace, build roads and wells, and defend its borders across millions of square kilometers. That takes way more than just a big army. It takes an absolutely brilliant organizational structure.
And here's the thing, the Mauryans didn't just stumble into this. Their success wasn't an accident. Their governance was guided by a really sophisticated political philosophy, which is most famously laid out in a text called the Arthashastra, attributed to the genius strategist Kautilya. It was basically a super practical guide to running a state.
And right at the heart of this philosophy was something called the Saptanga theory. Now, what's so cool about this is that it didn't just see the state as a patch of land. No, it saw the state as a living body, with 7 vital, interconnected parts. And if even one of those limbs was weak, the whole body would get sick.
And this lays out those 7 limbs perfectly. You've got the king, the head, the ministers, the eyes, the territory, the legs, the forts, the arms, the treasury, that's the mouth that feeds the state, the military, the strength of will, and finally, the allies, the ears. Every single part had a crucial role, and you needed all of them to have a healthy, thriving empire.
So, with that blueprint in mind, let's get into the good stuff and see how they actually put this theory into practice. We're going to break down the gears of the Mauryan administrative machine, from the very, very top all the way down to a single village.
At the absolute center of everything, of course, was the king. He was the supreme authority. But a king can't rule alone, right? So he was advised by his top officials, called the Tirthas, and a council of ministers, the Mantri Parshad. And then, and this is so key, the day-to-day work was handled by a whole army of superintendents, or adhyakshas, each one in charge of a very specific government department.
And get this, the level of specialization is just mind-blowing. There was an adhyaksha for pretty much everything. The Panyadayaksha, he oversaw all of commerce. The Siddhadaksha managed farming on government-owned land. They even had a Pauntavadaksha just to make sure weights and measures were the same across the entire empire. This wasn't just governing, this was micromanagement on an absolutely epic scale.
So, how do you manage all that territory? Well, you break it down. The empire was divided into provinces, each with its own strategic capital city. And here's the clever part. To make sure everyone stayed loyal, these provinces were often run by a Kumar, a royal prince. It was great training for him, and it kept him firmly tied to the emperor's authority.
And that chain of command just kept going, all the way down in this perfect pyramid. Below the prince, you had the Pradeshika, the district head. Underneath them were officials like the Gopa and Stanika, who managed clusters of villages. And right at the very bottom, the foundation of it all, was the Gramika, the village headman. He was the final link connecting every single community back to the central government.
So how did they pay for all of this? Well, with a highly organized and really diverse tax system. The biggest source of cash was the land tax, the baga, but they also collected customs duties, charged tolls on roads, and made money from state monopolies on things like mining and salt. And the whole operation was overseen by a chief tax collector called the Samaharta.
And all that revenue funded a colossal military. And we're not talking about a temporary group of soldiers. This was a professional, salaried, full-time, standing army. It was a state-of-the-art fighting force for its time, with infantry, cavalry, chariots, and of course, the empire's legendary war elephants. All of it was managed by its own dedicated war office.
But it wasn't just about soldiers and brute force. To really stay in control, you need information. And boy, did the Mauryans have an information network. It was one of the most sophisticated spy systems in the ancient world. You had Sanstha, who were stationary spies, maybe pretending to be a merchant or a monk, just blending in. Then you had Sanchari, the total opposite. They were mobile agents, always moving around. And get this, you had Pratavadakas, special reporters who had the incredible power to go directly to the king, anytime, day or night, to tell him what was going on.
So we've got this incredibly efficient, well-oiled administrative machine. But then, under one of its most famous rulers, Emperor Ashoka, the entire purpose of that machine is about to get a major update. After the devastating Kalinga War, he had a change of heart that would reshape the empire.
Ashoka's reign is just a totally unique moment in world history. He was apparently so horrified by the sheer violence of his own conquest of Kalinga that he embraced Buddhism and decided he wanted to rule not just through power, but through morality.
And this is the whole pivot, right here. The official policy of the empire shifted from Barigosa, which means conquest by the drum of war, to Dhammagosa, which means conquest by the drum of Dharma, or righteousness. It was a fundamental change from military expansion to moral and ethical governance.
Now, he didn't tear down the machine he inherited. Nope. He just gave it a whole new mission. He appointed these special officers of righteousness, the Dhamma Mahamatras, to promote welfare and good behavior. He set up new judges for rural areas. And he used that whole administrative network to carve his famous edicts on rocks and pillars all over the country, kind of like the ancient world's version of a mass media campaign, and to fund huge public works projects for the people.
So after all that, what does it all add up to? What is the ultimate legacy of this incredible administrative system? Well, after the Mauryans, the subcontinent would break apart again, but the memory of what they accomplished would never be forgotten.
On the one hand, the system's strengths were huge. That centralized authority and incredible efficiency meant they could keep the peace and build things on a massive scale. But there was a fatal flaw. The whole thing was almost completely dependent on how good the emperor was. After a strong ruler like Ashoka died, his weaker successors just couldn't hold the vast machine together, and the empire crumbled pretty quickly.
But even with that weakness, its impact was just massive and long-lasting. The Mauryan administration basically created the very idea of a unified political India. For more than 1,000 years after, it became the benchmark, the blueprint that all future empires would try to live up to.
And that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. When you look back at this 2,300-year-old system, with its focus on structure, its detailed bureaucracy, its spy network for accountability, and its eventual shift towards public welfare, you have to wonder, what lessons, if any, could a system that old hold for the challenges we faced in governing today?